Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and in this video I want to answer the question, what is Hellenistic astrology? So, Hellenistic astrology is a tradition of astrology that emerged in what historians call the Hellenistic period, which is a period of time in the ancient Mediterranean after the conquests of Alexander the Great, when he conquered much of the known world from a European perspective. So what happened is that Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamian Egypt, which was the area where there were two very long traditions of astrology that were being practiced by the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. So the Mesopotamians had developed the zodiac, and the Egyptians had developed a concept that eventually led to, or was a precursor to, the idea of the 12 houses. So what happened is that when Alexander conquered these two areas, these traditions started to intermingle and eventually were merged. And what happened after those traditions were merged is that this new system or new tradition of astrology emerged somewhere around the 1st century BCE, especially in Egypt and likely out of the city of Alexandria. And this new tradition of astrology had similarities to some of the older traditions because it drew on pieces of them, like the zodiac and the decans from Egypt and from Mesopotamia. However, it also had introduced a number of new concepts and techniques. And what's important about this new system is that it's the first time that the fourfold system that we're familiar with today in Western astrology sort of shows up on the historical timeline. So this is the fourfold system that consists of the planets, the signs of the zodiac, the concept of aspects, and the concept of the 12 houses. So these are all of the basic components that astrologers have been looking at in birth charts and other astrological charts for the past 2,000 years, and that they take for granted today. But this system of using those four pieces together in charts sort of emerges at this point in time around the 1st century BCE. And this is the emergence of what we call Hellenistic astrology. So Hellenistic astrology was practiced largely during the course of the Roman Empire in the ancient Mediterranean region from about the 1st century BCE until approximately the 7th century CE. And although Hellenistic astrology essentially represents the basis or the original type of modern Western astrology, or what became modern Western astrology today, until recently, many of the techniques and the texts associated with this tradition had been lost because they either weren't transmitted or they weren't translated into modern languages. So modern astrologers didn't really know much about ancient astrology or how it was practiced. They just sort of had some vague idea that their tradition goes back at least 2,000 or 3,000 years, but didn't know much about how their traditions today compared to the traditions 2,000 years ago. So what happened is that over the course of the past 2 or 3 decades, a number of astrologers and academics have started to translate some of these ancient astrological texts that were primarily written in Greek and Latin into modern languages. And as a result of those translations, we've suddenly started to learn what ancient astrology was like. And although it has some similarities to modern Western astrology, there's also a lot of major differences, and there were a lot of surprises when these techniques and these texts were rediscovered and published. So one of the things that happened is that we started discovering that the ancient texts contained the rationale for a number of basic techniques and concepts that astrologers still use today, but just sort of take for granted and don't really understand where it came from or how they were developed. So there's certain concepts like the 12 houses and the meanings of the 12 houses, which are just sort of, it's just sort of a tradition that's passed on that astrologers take for granted what the meaning of the 12 houses are, but they don't know how they were originally developed. And through translating some of these texts, we've actually gotten to and found the conceptual rationale, and that there's actually a very interesting and very compelling conceptual rationale for how the meanings of the houses were first developed sometime around the 1st century BCE. And you can actually access that and see it much more clearly by studying the original texts of the Western astrological tradition. So sometimes studying ancient astrology helps us to understand Western astrology better and how it was first developed. In other areas, there have been techniques and concepts that it turned out we had lost over the course of the transmission of astrology over the past 2,000 years that we didn't even know we were missing. So some of these are basic concepts like the concept of sect, which is the distinction between day and night charts. And one of the things that does is it introduces an interpretive distinction between people who were born during the day versus people who were born at night. And when you think about that, that's such a major and such an obvious astronomical distinction to make, the difference between day and night, which we all experience on a daily basis. And yet for some reason in modern astrology, that hadn't survived as an important interpretive principle. But recently it has been recovered from Hellenistic astrology, and it turns out that it's a very useful concept in practice that has some major implications for how we interpret charts. So that's just a basic concept. There's also a number of advanced techniques, including a whole collection of timing techniques, which are known as Time Lord systems. And one of the most impressive ones and powerful Time Lord techniques that's been rediscovered so far is a technique known as zodiacal releasing. And zodiacal releasing will divide a person's entire life up into chapters and subsections as if the life was a book, and you were able to identify where one chapter starts and another chapter ends in terms of the overall narrative of the native's life. So zodiacal releasing can do some really impressive and really cool things in terms of making predictions about a person's life. And ultimately, that's the primary thing in terms of the recovery of some of the techniques of Hellenistic astrology, is that although modern Western astrology has gone in more of a direction of character analysis and using astrology for psychological purposes, when you go back and study ancient astrology, what you're seeing is a pure form of predictive astrology. And it holds the potential to sort of allow astrologers to practice a more advanced form of predictive astrology again, with everything that kind of goes along with that. So as a result of that, that's one of the reasons that I like to say that by looking back into the past, we can create a better astrology for the future. And part of that is by going back and recovering some of these techniques and then bringing them forward. Although I don't think that we necessarily need to go back into the past and stay there, but instead it's more of a process of going back into the past, finding out what was lost and what techniques are relevant and still useful to us today, and then bringing them forward and merging them with some of the useful techniques that are still practiced and that were developed by astrologers in modern times. And through that process, we'll create a synthesis of the ancient and the modern traditions, which will move astrology forward fully into the 21st century. So over the past decade, Hellenistic astrology has started to be practiced and has become fully revived again. In 2017, I published a book on the topic titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, which is one of the first comprehensive treatments of Hellenistic astrology in modern times. I also teach an online course on Hellenistic astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, where I have over 100 hours of video lectures on the history, philosophy, and the techniques of ancient astrology. So if you're interested in learning more about the subject, then please check out one of those resources. I'll put some links to each of them in the description for this video below. But otherwise, I hope that this has interested you and given you some insight into what so many astrologers are becoming excited about when it comes to ancient astrology and the potential that it holds for the practice of astrology in modern times. So thanks a lot for watching. Good luck in your studies, and I'll see you again next time.